So, in your estimation, how important is interfaith and intrafaith dialogue? What are the benefits of engaging with Christians and Muslims, but also with Reform and conservative Jews? As an Orthodox rabbi, what are your goals regarding this endeavor?
So many things to say about the way you phrased the question. First of all, personally, I don't like the term interfaith. I'm not, obviously, faith is there within religion, but religion is more than faith. And if I'm already saying religion is more than faith, let me say God is more than religion. These, I think, two very important things to bear in mind. There's a very interesting social scientist in Britain, I think the name of Douglas Marshall, and he speaks of religion being made out of 3 B's: belief, behavior, and belonging. And this is really important to bear this in mind, because different religions are different composites of these elements, with one having a greater focus on one at the expense of the other. And I'm not even sure that with regards to some of the religions of the East, the Dharma religions, you can even talk of them in belief systems in that sense. And I would say for Judaism, belonging is very often even more than belief. I mean, this is something that neither Christianity nor Islam could say, but you've got that comment of Chazal, I think it's in Eicha Rabati, in the Midrash, where Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, is presented as saying, if only you can forget me, but keep my Torah. Right. I think that's the phrase that it says. In other words, that while belief obviously is inextricably there with regards to the dimension of religion, religion is more than belief. Religion, especially for Judaism, is a way of life. It's conduct in which you deepen your awareness of the divine in every aspect of living. And not for nothing is there no actual mitzvah to believe, even though Rambam does define it as such. As so many of the other Rishonim point out, and later, there is no explicit command to believe. God is taken as understood and the foundation of your transcendent morality. But telling somebody to believe something that they don't believe is not going to make them believe. So it doesn't really make enormous sense anyway.
Emunah is faithfulness, not
Exactly so.
I believe that the knowledge to know is regarding the Achdut Hashem, not the concept of God, right? So
yes, yes, that's true. But he does define it as, he does use the word when he defines the mitzvah as a mitzvah in terms of belief. So of course, Rambam goes much further and says to know God and to love God means essentially to get involved in science,
right?
Scientific research and understanding. And that if you are, if you don't know sciences and you haven't studied biology and chemistry and physics, you cannot truly love God.
Right. He's calling for a deeper understanding. Right. Yeah, of course.
Right,
yes.
right. But but nevertheless, anyway, so that's why I prefer to use the word interreligious rather than interfaith. Sorry, that was a bit of a diversion there from the focus. But of course, I think we need to make a big distinction between relations between religions and relations between the different segments of our own family. Because that's really important also that's why I think Marshall's comment about belonging is important. We take it for granted, but we need to remind ourselves that the way we relate to one another as Jews is born out of our historical sense that we are part of an extended family. And I don't think we can even explain ourselves adequately to our non-Jewish interlocutors without that understanding. That we don't just see our people as a collection based upon religious tenets, but we see ourselves as an extended family, a people out of which a religion emerges, and a religion out of which a sense of peoplehood is preserved. And these two dimensions are so totally inextricable. And therefore, I think that when we relate to different segments of the Jewish world, even if we have our own understanding as Orthodox Jews as to what should be the desirable way of life born out of our religious heritage and convictions, nevertheless, our relationship must be born to Jews who are different from us out of a sense of family responsibility and obligations. You might not always like your brother or your cousin, but he's your brother and he's your cousin. And there's a responsibility in that regard. And that sense of family fidelity and responsibility is the idea behind Klal Yisrael. Of course, that's also used theologically in the idea of the people in covenantal language in relation to the Holy One, blessed be He. But I think when we are in a family-orientated state of mind, our behavior will be a more positive one than when we lose sight and memory of that family connectedness. So I think that with regards to the different segments of the Jewish people, the very idea that somebody can be disregarded or even disqualified should be abhorrent to us. This should only be something we could contemplate when it really threatens our very existence, when it threatens the existence of the family itself. Now, of course, there are many Jews within Haredi society and even within modern Orthodoxy who would say non-Orthodox forms of Judaism actually do threaten the very existence of the future of Torah observance. But as I said at the beginning, I don't think that's true. I think today within our secular world, the real threat is total alienation and total disinterest. And therefore, we should see any form that seeks to deepen a connectedness amongst the people and to our heritage as something to be encouraged. It's perfectly legitimate on the part of Orthodox Jews to see this as different stages. I don't think it's fair to expect us to be able to affirm the absolute desirability of every alternative form of Jewish expression as being the authentic expression of pluralism. Pluralism doesn't mean that everything is the same. It means that you are willing to recognize that there are different ways and different paths. And therefore, I think that we need to have a positive approach towards every segment of the population that's trying to deepen some sense of meaning, purpose, and value to Jewish existence. Now, in some way, there is a parallel beyond that. So when we talk about the interreligious world. So I got involved in interreligious engagement when I was a very young rabbi in South Africa. I was actually rabbi of what was at the time the largest Orthodox congregation in the world. We had a membership of 10,000, and in the summer we had 1,500 in shul in the Bet Knesset on Shabbat. In the winter it went down to about half the size. But this was I was there, a very young rabbi in the early mid 70s. When apartheid, the racist regime, was at its height. And my wife and I decided we could only stay in South Africa if we were going to take a stand, which both meant in terms of any employees, of how we treated our employees, but also meant for me taking a stand congregationally, which eventually meant also publicly in the general public context as a result of the murder of the Black leader Steve Biko and the Soweto riots, all those events that took place. And it was very important for me to be able to, not only because I believe Judaism required me out of social justice to be engaged in the struggle against an evil system, but to be seen, for Judaism and Jewish leaders to be seen by the non-Jewish world as committed to advancing justice and human dignity as fundamental values from our religious heritage. And so I actually founded, together with other religious leaders there, the first time ever, something we call the Interfaith Forum, Council of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the first one of its kind, in Cape Town. And as I say, I came to my involvement in this out of a commitment to social justice, but as I came into it, I discovered that here were people, educated people, very often wonderful people, but who were incredibly ignorant about Jews and Judaism, I assumed if you're a Christian, well, it's rooted within the Hebrew Bible, so you must know something about Jews and Judaism. Not only did they not, they had all distorted and prejudicial ideas, not because they were bad people, but that's what they'd been fed. They didn't know any better. And the case with the Muslims, it was obviously the result of the political conflict here in the Middle East and the negative attitudes and ideas that had been to a degree purified from Christianity, had now undergone a kind of Islamicization and had been embraced in an Islamic propaganda and idea. And I realized that it was critically important for me to meet these people to overcome prejudice, misunderstanding, and negative image. But I realized at the same time that while they were pretty ignorant about me, I was pretty ignorant about them too, and I had all misconceptions about them. And if I want to be understood, I needed to understand. Yeah. So I came into this area out of commitment to social justice, but realized it was critically important to overcome prejudice and bigotry towards me and my community and my heritage. In other words, to combat anti-Semitism. But at the same time, I discovered here were people who deeply believed in values that were dear and holy to me. The dignity of the human person, the sanctity of the family, the pursuit of justice and righteousness, the pursuit of peace. If I believe in those, don't I have an obligation to work with those who believe in those values too? If I don't, am I not in some way betraying those values? I have an obligation surely to work together to be greater than the sum of the different parts. So I realized that interreligious collaboration and cooperation was actually essential to be true to my own values. Now, of course, it does pose a challenge, but I found that the challenge was a blessed one, because in encountering the other, I had to examine much more what my own beliefs, convictions, and teachings were, especially when I had to present them. Because when you become a teacher, you need to know how to be able to present it, and you have to master the material but more effectively. I would say that for the committed and knowledgeable Jew, interreligious or interfaith relations, however you want to call them, actually deepen one's religious commitment and identity. There is a problem for those who come to it from the lowest common denominator and from positions of ignorance and unfamiliarity with their own heritage. And there is a challenge. That's why I would like to see more learned and well-educated Jews being those who are leading the field of interreligious engagement rather than people who do not have the background in it. But beyond that, I must confess, when I got involved in this process, until I got involved in this world, I never ever considered, what does it mean that there are other religions in the world? What is the Almighty saying to me in the very existence of these? I surely can't seriously believe that all Gentiles are in the world there simply to serve the Jewish people. And surely I can't believe that all forms of engagement with the divine are irrelevant in terms of the greater scheme of things. If God relates to us in all our diversity, there must be diverse ways of relating to God. And I would say, encountering that deep moral, ethical, and spiritual beauty in the other that I found in meeting with people from different cultures, different religions, even with theologies that I might find problematic and might seek to reject, it nevertheless still was an enormous enrichment to me to be able to perceive the enormity of the divine presence in the world beyond my own particular religious heritage and world. And I think that relates to what we were talking about before about certain other midot. Because when you live in that world, then I think it must instill in you, if you are really alive to what I'm being describing, a certain theological humility. And it must counteract a certain dangerous arrogance. And therefore, for me, the interreligious encounter is important to combat anti-Semitism. It is important to be able to promote shared values. But it's also important for me, for us, and I believe ultimately for the Jewish people, so that we can truly be a light within the world at large.
This was Rabbi Sacks, his biggest message, I believe. He wrote a book. Are you familiar with Rabbi Sacks's book, Dignity of Difference?
Yes, I'm also familiar with the original version. Do you know there were two versions?
Yes, I was going to mention that. Okay, so he kind of, yeah.
It's no, I mean, this is always a problem. This is a problem, especially within Orthodoxy, and it's what a late colleague of mine, who was a great Talmid Chacham, he was a rabbi in New York for a while and then went back to England. He actually was originally Irish. Isaac Bernstein used to call orthodoxy by intimidation. Yeah. Or I heard someone else refer to it as right shoulder cramp. everybody's stuck looking over the right wing of the etc. And it's unfortunate that very often some of the greatest minds do not feel the capacity, the need, or they might feel the need, do not feel that they have the ability to stand up to those further on the right who use this tool of intimidation to try to impose their views upon others.
So actually, I want to get into that because what happened, what you mentioned before is understanding other faiths, and the importance of understanding other faiths, but many Jews, I would say most Jews, don't even understand Judaism themselves and their history. And there's a lot of censorship involved, and there's a lot of this, and I believe, maybe it's a radical thing to say because I'm against further division or denominational, separation or schisms, but I do believe that Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, should be sovereign and stand on its own and kind of be its own thing, as opposed to what it is right now, which is kowtowing to the Haredi elite as the religious, doctrine and the ideal. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
Of course, very much, and I think it's important for us to realize that there are different kinds of orthodoxy that we refer to as non-Haredi orthodoxy, because I'm very happy that you use the term modern orthodoxy. It's a term I use too. And modern for me is not a concessionary adjective.
Correct.
It is an affirmation in which I'm saying I am part of the modern world. And I see the modern world as part of the manifestation of God's glory within our world too. And therefore, the term secular for me is not an enemy, is not a term of the enemy. Secular means worldly. It simply means opening up. I'm not original in emphasizing this. In many respects, when Rav Kook talks of the Kedusha within the Chol, within the secular, he's saying precisely that.
Yeah.
And I know Rabbi Yitz Greenberg has written powerfully about in terms of the value of the secular. And so for me, when I say I'm modern Orthodox, I mean that I believe living within the world at large is the way a Jew should live, is the way I believe God wants me to live. In that sense, for me, Rambam, who you see yourselves as his students, as we all should, is for me the epitome of modern Orthodoxy in his time. In fact, Rambam would be considered to be too modern in many Haredi circles today. He was too much of a free thinker. He was involved in philosophy and in science. He wouldn't be welcome in many of the yeshivot that we learn in today and where he is studied. And that's part of the reaction. In fact, the Haredi world is a literally reactionary phenomenon. It's a modern, actually, and from a historical point of view, reactionary withdrawal from modernity.
Yes.
And
the reform movement.
Now, many Jews who are called modern Orthodox are not really modern Orthodox. They are dressing in a certain way, and they are going to university to some extent bal korcham. They feel almost that they have to, not because they really would like to, because they think that those living in the Haredi world are more authentic than they are, and they've compromised with modernity. And that's not authentic modern Orthodoxy. That's basically crypto-Haredi Judaism, and they're crypto-Haredi.
Exactly what it is. Exactly.
Yeah. But a real modern Orthodoxy sees the blessings of modernity as gifts that we are obliged to integrate into our Jewish life and to nurture our Jewish life. And so many aspects of contemporary Jewish life are more authentically Jewish because of modernity. It's in so many different areas that one could point to, not least of all, the field of human rights. Now, I'm not saying there's no abuse of human rights within modern society, but the fact that modern society has been able to empower people for human dignity to be more respected by law and by political structures, that is, modernity has allowed the teaching of Tselem Elokim, that is the Judaism's fundamental contribution to humanity at large, to be greater realized in our time. And those who do not embrace that and who fear the modern world and who therefore withdraw from the modern world are less authentically Jewish in terms of the spirit of Judaism's embrace of the world at large. That's what modern Orthodoxy needs to affirm. It needs to affirm its authenticity, not that it's secondary status and giving, as it were, the Haredi world the prize. And now, unfortunately, or inevitably, if you affirm the modern world and you affirm modern studies, then you are not going to have as many people steeped in the degree of Torah learning or the degree of Torah expertise as you will have in a world that has no other interests outside it. And therefore, it's inevitable that there are going to be more greater Torah scholars within the Haredi world than there are within the modern Orthodox world. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they are more authentic in their implementation of Torah and the way Torah should be lived within the modern world.
And if I may,
yes,
Rabbi
please.
Sacks talked about this. He says the issues confronting contemporary halakha is not due to lack of creativity, but the sociological divorce between the centers of Pesak and the centers of congregational life. So even if they are writing, amazing Pesak or very deep, ideas, if they're divorced from what's happening in reality, then I wouldn't say that it's a more insightful version of let's say Pesak. It's detached from reality.
Absolutely. I mean, for so many generations, our greatest Chachamim taught that there is the fifth section of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the reality that you have to address in society. And therefore, if you are detached from society, you are not able to give a psak that is fully authentic. But we have to recognize that today, what modernity did do is it led to a fragmentation. And we have different elements. Now, I don't deny the right of every different. If I don't deny the right to the left, I certainly shouldn't deny it to the right of every community to be able to live Judaism according to the way they understand it best. But I believe that a true modern orthodoxy is the fullest expression of authentic Torah living. And I think we do have wonderful Talmidei Chachamim, and we have enough of them within our world to be able to serve the needs of modern orthodoxy. But we need to make sure that we uphold them and that we take them seriously and that we empower them.
Look, with Pesak, maybe, like we said, we're not having people that are full-time, Kola learners to bring out, these, vast poskim. But if you look at contributions that, like with Haretzion, for an example,
Yes.
which you're an alum,
Yes.
Haretzion, Male Adumim, there are, new avenues in how to learn Tanakh, new avenues in Torah thought that is being brought out daily. Maggid Publishing is doing an incredible job bringing out new ideas, and you have people like Rabbi David Foreman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but there are
Yeshiva University also is an example.
Yeshiva University. In terms of Jewish thought, I think modern Orthodoxy is really, really, really making it's strong. We have a dearth of new ideas, new ways of reading Tanakh. We're really kind of going forward with that. It's just Pesak, which is not ever going to be the same because we're just, practically speaking, we're not sitting and learning all day.
I don't know.
No, it's not just because we're not learning all day. It's also because we do not see the Daled Amot of the Beit Midrash as being the exclusive context of Pesak. Today, Pesak has to take into account a much greater merchav, a much greater context. And therefore, it's those who are addressing the broader context that are giving the authentic Pesak for our times.
Absolutely.
But my point is that, even in the Haredi world, there's a scale or there's a spectrum of belief and practice within the Haredi world, the same way there is in the modern Orthodox world, but we're not like self-governing, meaning if there's some type of controversy, like Rabbi Sacks gets into some controversy, he has to run to, kiss the hands of the Gedolim,
exactly,
to kind of, which is silly, we shouldn't have to do that. We are our own people, right? We are our own group.
Absolutely. I would prefer not to make this ad hominem. Rabbi Sacks was an outstanding personality, a remarkable writer, a remarkable presenter of Yiddishkeit, many, many wonderful values. But to some extent, it's very difficult if you are a Baal Teshuvah and you have not actually grown up within the milieu of practicing orthodoxy to stand up against those who intimidate from the right wing. But so as a result, there often is capitulation. I would say, actually, in the context of British Jewry, there has been too much capitulation on the part of chief rabbis to what is formally called the court of the chief rabbi, the Bet Din. And what's happened in Anglo Jewry since the Second World War is that the Dayanim that were appointed were Haredi Dayanim. And in more recent times, I would say previous two chief rabbis, it's an almost entirely Haredi Bet Din that is not really attuned with the needs of the present time. I would say one of the most significant acts on the part of the present chief rabbi in Britain, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, who incidentally I brought to Ireland, and he succeeded me as chief rabbi of Ireland. He was rabbi of one of the congregations, and then he succeeded me as chief rabbi afterwards. One of the most significant things, and I can't think of any chief rabbi who has stood up to a Bet Din in modern memory, were the guidelines he gave for Jewish schools with a treatment to gay students, as to how you treat students that have homosexual tendencies. And the very fact that he was prepared to address it was considered an anathema by his Bet Din. Amazing. The fact that he uses fundamental Jewish teaching with guidelines to how to behave with compassion and understanding to all these people is a great tribute to the fact that he's shown a modern Orthodox approach as opposed to a narrow Harei mind which tries to ignore the problem altogether.
Right, because these things are just going to keep coming up. That's just the reality right now.
It has to be addressed.
We have to address these things. We're going to have to develop some sort of, we can't just pretend that these things don't exist and just close ourselves off to everything and just say, it just doesn't work.
Well, I see the problem also with, like, for example, the Haredi world. They kind of have the Asifa convention and these things about not using like smartphones because we might be bombarded with information. I don't think it's pornography they're only afraid of. I think it's being afraid of discovering what Judaism really is and the world and our history. And, like, for example, I think what's healthy is that, Rabbi Joshua Berman, someone like that should be curriculum for every yeshiva student, modern yeshiva student in America. Why? Because we need to go to university, right? And then we need to be able to stand up against academia's attacks against the Torah. So if we're going to pretend that it doesn't exist, we're going to do what the Haredim do, which is avoid university altogether. And that is extremely dangerous.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. But of course, I would add that going to university and becoming educated there isn't simply to stand up to attacks. It has a value in and of itself. Correct. And we mustn't allow that to be lost sight of.
Yes. Well, I don't know if you have time for one more short question. One more. So we just want to talk about, because we want to end on a hopeful note about, is there hope for the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And if there, let's say, is going to be a historic agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is rumored to be happening, do you think that will have a trickle-down effect on the conflict? Or is it, something completely separate? Because the Abraham Accords hasn't necessarily improved the situation with the Palestinians.
So that I'm very involved. I mean, in terms of my interfaith work, probably I was better known more for my work with the Christian world, and especially leading to the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and the Vatican, which I was privileged to negotiate with, and the work of the chief rabbinate of Israel interfacing with the Christian world mostly falls on my shoulders in terms of the content. I'm not employed by the chief rabbinate, but I'm the beneficiary of other people's ignorance and absence. So when Israel started negotiating with the Vatican, I was brought in to have somebody who at least knows the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, if not between B'nai Or and B'nai Choshech. And similarly, when the chief rabbinate is asked by a pope to have a bilateral commission, you can't say no to a pope, so you need an Orthodox rabbi who at least knows what he's doing. So the content of this commission falls on my shoulders, and I feel a great privilege and honor to do that. But in recent years, the focus has been much more on the Muslim world. And I've spent a lot of time, and I do spend a lot of time in the Gulf. And you may know that I was in Saudi Arabia before Corona. I was the first Israeli received by the King of Saudi Arabia in the palace in Riyadh. I participated in an interreligious conference just a couple of months ago in Riyadh. And amazing things are happening, especially in the UAE, and this Abrahamic family house that's going up there, that's building a mosque next to a synagogue, next to a church, but in a campus, each one with their own integrity, but born out of a vision of the leadership of the UAE, is something quite amazing with enormous potential for the future. I could go on and on about that. But Saudi Arabia, you're certainly right, within the Arab world is the great prize.
Yeah.
Because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is where the two holiest shrines of Islam are. It's seen the bedrock of Islam. And in many respects, other countries will, if not genuflect, squint towards Saudi Arabia. I was also a few months ago in Indonesia, where we're doing some amazing work, where we've been able to educate, thanks to the technology that we are using now as Zoom, some 4,000 madrasa teachers in an introduction to Judaism and Jewish-Muslim relations that impacts already about 5 million students, which is amazing in a country where there are no diplomatic relations with Israel, where the image of Jews and Judaism has been very, very negative with propaganda, enormous openness and great things developing. But there they are very open that if there are relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it will immediately open the way for Indonesia. And there's no question that it would change things dramatically. Whether there's a chance of a diplomatic relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel being established before anything positive happens on the Palestinian front, that's the question. There's no question that until now, it has been the absence of any movement of the Palestinian front that has prevented Saudi Arabia from going where it would like to go. And princes who I've met, Saudi princes and other political leaders, have been very frank in telling me that. And I've communicated it to the best of my ability. But it doesn't seem that the circumstances are considered to be most appropriate for things to be moving ahead here in Israel in relation to the Palestinian population. And who knows, with the present government or the government that's about to be composed, where this will lead. I hope that it will be a process in which some of the most militant right-wing elements will realize how important it is for their interests for us to be able to move towards a positive reconciliation of the conflict. And often when extreme elements are brought into positions of power and authority, their attitudes are mitigated and they become more pragmatic and more constructive. So I'm praying for that. I can't be sure that that will be the case. I think any conflagration that takes place on the Temple Mount could undermine the whole of the movement of the Abraham Accords and could be very, very dangerous. And that certainly would prevent Saudi Arabia from being able to move ahead. But Saudi Arabia would like to move ahead, and Israel would like to move ahead with Saudi Arabia. The question is whether that Palestinian issue can be addressed. It doesn't have to be resolved. Just to address it, in my opinion, I don't know. This is narrative for me. In my opinion, if Israel was just to say to the Palestinians, let's now get back to the negotiating table and try and start again and see where we can go and see what's possible. Just the statement that it would be willing to negotiate with the Palestinians, I think, would open the way for Saudi Arabia, in my opinion. But I'm not sure that we are ready to do that. So I don't know where we are in the short term. In the long term, I have absolutely no doubt that a sea change has taken place within the Arab world and the Muslim world beyond, and that sooner or later there will be a process of broader expansion of the Abraham Accords. And I'm very hopeful. Again, it's hope that can easily be dashed and destroyed, but I am hopeful that that will allow for a regional peace conference, because I personally can't see how we can resolve the Palestinian problem at the moment without it being on a regional basis with all the regional parties involved. But I think with the regional parties, we could resolve the conflict. This would require American leadership. I don't see it at the moment, but things change very rapidly in the world of politics and international politics, and therefore I think the possibilities are there. The importance of reaching a resolution to the conflict with the Palestinians, or resolving the conflict here at large, needs to be understood in the context of our conversation until now. It's not just critically important for Israel's security. It's not just critically important for Palestinian dignity and flourishing. It's critically important for the well-being of Judaism because
Yes.
Judaism itself is held hostage by militancy, by fear, by alienation, by concepts of conflict that pollute the most wonderful and sublime values of our heritage and do not allow them to flourish. So peace is a religious imperative. And as we all know, Chazal point out that there is nothing else that we are obliged to seek and to pursue in every place and every time. And this is part of the point. That's why it's written, Bakesh Shalom v'rodfehu. Bakeshehu b'makom echad v'rodfehu b'makom acher. And part of what that is saying is that we need to understand the pursuit of peace is an ongoing process, and you must never rest upon your laurels.
And I think what happened, what's interesting is that all this time the world was saying you first have to have peace with the Palestinians, you first have to have peace with the Palestinians, and then we come to the table, and then time after time, starting with Arafat, and even after, they rejected whatever offer was made, not willing to negotiate. But what happens is that Israel kind of changed their approach and was like, okay, you know what, let's go after the 98%. And kind of work from there and prove that we can actually make peace in the first place, that we're willing partners.
I think our narratives, both the Jewish Israeli narrative, the predominant Jewish Israeli narrative, and the predominant Palestinian narrative, are both a little too simplistic. There have been many mistakes along the road by many parties in many different ways. I'm not saying that there's an equivalency here, but I'm saying that I think that I hope and I pray the day will come and we will look back and say, why couldn't we have got here sooner?
Beautiful. And one last thing, just before we go, related to what you said about the propaganda that exists like on the ground. So a lot of these countries that we have peace with for many years, even Egypt, if you go to Egypt, you can't walk around with like a kippah. You have to, they hate us. There's still cartoons about, hook-nosed Jews with money bags and all that. So are these people, forget about putting those people aside, but let's say just the new, countries that we're making peace with, are they attempting to try to, kind of impact the people on the ground?
So the change in the UAE, in the Emirates in particular, is absolutely dramatic. Absolutely. But of course, it's much easier to bring about a whole-scale transformation of your country when only 20% are indigenous and 80% are foreign expatriates working in the country in one form or another. Also, when you are a monarchy and an absolute monarchy, and when dissent is not tolerated, you can bring about an immediate transformation. But it's also when you're a country where you've been part of international discourse and international commerce, it becomes much easier too. So I think the UAE is pretty exceptional. But the UAE, as opposed to other countries, to the best of my knowledge, never had textbooks that were teaching people the same degree of hatred that there were in certain other countries. But here is the rub. Thanks to our involvement, it's not only been my organization, the American Jewish Committee, and other organizations have been involved in it. We've been working on this many years. Thanks to the changes that have taken place in Saudi Arabia, in the course of the last 2 years, the overhaul of the textbooks has been dramatic. And all the anti-Semitic and anti-Christian material that was in the textbooks has been removed.
Amazing.
I'm not saying that they've become Zionists and that there is any adulation of Israel in it, but nevertheless, it's been a dramatic change. And there you have a much larger population, and whatever's done at the leadership does not necessarily automatically mean that the population at large embraces it. But it's a process, and there's enough dramatic testimonies to it, like those that I mentioned about interfaith things having represented, not only having a dozen rabbis that they had at the Interfaith conference, both from the States and from Europe, and I was the only one from Israel, but also representatives of even from the religions from the East, in a country which portrayed itself until recently as a kind of a Muslim Vatican, where there wasn't room for any other kind of religion whatsoever, are all dramatic changes, which are all extremely hopeful and do impact to differing degrees at different paces the population at large. So I have no doubt that we have an enormous opportunity here. This is a stage where amazing changes have happened and are happening. However, were we to be able to move even a little way forward on the front in terms of our relationships as Israelis, as the Jewish people, with the Palestinians, this would unquestionably have an enormous impact and would change attitudes. I too don't wear my yarmulke, don't wear my kippah when I'm in Egypt or in Jordan, even though these are two countries which we have diplomatic relations with. I used to walk around in Morocco before the Abraham Accords with my kippah perfectly happily. And I used to do that in Tunisia as well when I would visit Tunisia before the Arab Spring. So there are very different contexts within the Arab world, and it's very wrong of us to try to use generalizations about Arabs or Muslims. They vary and they differ very significantly. Egypt is a particular problem, which we don't really have the time to go into what are the circumstances behind and what are the realities. But were something to move ahead positively in relation to the Palestinian population, it would be possible to change attitudes there too.
Thank you so much for the clarity there. And we really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Sorry for going a little over time. We wanted to enjoy every moment with you. So thank you for everything that you do, and hatzlacha.
Shavua tov.
Thank you. Shavua tov and b'hatzlacha to you too.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.